Welcome, everyone, to the Real News Network YouTube channel. And thank you so much for joining us today for this special live stream. My name is Maximillian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief here at the Real News. It's so great to have you all with us.
I'm freelance journalist and Real News contributor Mel Buer, and Max and I are very excited to be co-hosting this special live stream here at the Real News. Right now, we in the U.S. are closer to a national rail shutdown than we've been in a generation. In this country, because labor relations on the railroads are governed by the Railway Labor Act, not the National Labor Relations Act, there are a lot more procedural hurdles that need to be cleared before railroad workers can legally strike and railroad carriers can initiate lockouts. As I've reported on multiple occasions in recent months for the Real News, we have actually cleared most of those hurdles, and we are standing on the edge of a potentially historic shutdown of the nation's freight rail industry. After years of fruitless negotiations between the major rail carriers and the unions that collectively represent around 115,000 workers, the two sides officially reached an impasse in the late spring of this year. Then the National Mediation Board stepped in to try to broker an agreement between the two sides, but that mediation was unsuccessful, and the board declared negotiations at an official impasse on June 14th. That triggered a 30-day cooling off period. Then President Joe Biden appointed a Presidential Emergency Board, or PEB, in an effort to resolve the dispute. On July 14th, when the PEB was announced, the White House stated that the board would, quote, provide a structure for workers and management to resolve their disagreements. The board will investigate this dispute and, within 30 days of its establishment, deliver a report recommending how the dispute should be resolved. Then, in late August, the PEB released its 124-page report detailing recommendations for how the freight railroads and unions should structure an agreement to resolve the dispute. Both sides have the ability to reject the PEB's recommendations, and if they do, we will have cleared the final hurdle before a strike could be initiated. We're going to be breaking down the PEB recommendations with our guests today, but I guess we shouldn't bury the lead, and we should just let you know up top that the railroad carriers have enthusiastically endorsed the PEB recommendations. Railroad workers, however, are pissed, and we think you should know why.
So this is truly a watershed moment for the rail industry and, I think for the labor movement. What happens now and what's been happening on to the railroads and to the railroads for years directly affects all of us. And yet, if you only watch corporate media, you might only be hearing about this for the first or maybe the second time. And chances are you have not gotten the essential background context that you need to understand how and why we ended up here. That's why here at The Real News, we've been committed to providing y'all with continuing coverage of what's happening on the railroads and to bring you the voices of the people who know that industry best, the workers. This is obviously a editorial commitment for us here at The Real News to lift up the lives and voices and struggles of our fellow workers. And that's really how I myself got invested in this story, right? I was clued into this whole big mess that's happening on the freight railroads when I first reported earlier in the year on, the fact that in January, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, or the BLET, and the Transportation Division of the International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers, or SMART-TD, which together represent roughly 17,000 railroad workers, initiated steps to prepare for a strike that would have begun on February 1st. And I guess quick parentheses, we'll explain this in more detail later, but there are in fact a number of unions that collectively represent the different workers who work the railroads. It's not just, conductors and engineers. A lot of people make the railroads run. And so BLET and SMART-TD were prepared for their members who work at BNSF Railway to strike on February 1st, which would have comprised the largest railway strike in recent memory. And the union cited as their main point of contention a new scheduling and availability policy at BNSF Railway, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, which is owned by Warren Buffett. And, this policy, according to workers, as they were telling me back in January, would separate them from their families and make it next to impossible to live and reasonably plan their lives. And the BLET National President Dennis Pierce and Smart TD President Jeremy Ferguson even called BNSF's quote unquote high vis policy, quote, the worst and most egregious attendance policy ever adopted by any rail carrier, end quote. Then, at the very end of January, right before the strike was set to begin, a U.S. District Court judge, at the behest of BNSF, granted a restraining order and blocked the unions from striking over this draconian attendance policy. And the judge in that case said that a strike would cause the rail company, quote, substantial, immediate, and irreparable harm, end quote. The judge, however, had nothing to say about the substantial, immediate, and irreparable harm that the high-vis attendance policy would cause to workers, to BNSF, and to the supply chain in general. And so the attendance policy was allowed to go into effect. So, I had one of our guests today, Jeff Kurtz, the great Jeff Kurtz, on in January to talk about the BNSF high-vis policy. And from there, I started to learn more from Jeff and from other folks at Railroad Workers United and beyond about just how indicative the high-vis policy was of the larger problems that have been plaguing the railroads well before the pandemic, right? And then I had our other guest today, the great Ron Kamenko, also of Railroad Workers United, joined me and Jeff later in the year here at the Real News to talk about, basically what's happened since this policy has been allowed to go into effect at BNSF. And I'm sad to report, as they told me, that the policy has been as much of a disaster as workers and their families said it would be. And they have also said that it has caused irreparable damage to workers and to the supply chain. Workers are reportedly quitting in record numbers. Trains are lying idle at a moment when the supply chain is already under significant duress from COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine and extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. So then you have all of that kind of leading up to where we are now. But then you add on to the fact, as I learned in reporting on this, that in many ways the railroads are experiencing a self-induced crisis. In fact, going back to 2015, the major rail carriers have collectively eliminated 30% of their accrued workforce. And now they're complaining about a labor shortage that they themselves caused. And so I say all that just to say that, this is how we started reporting on it. And this is how we realized that there's a much bigger problem here. And that's when the great Mel Buer stepped in to do her own reporting on this issue. So Mel, what did you learn and what did you report on and what did you learn in doing that work?
When I first started reporting on this issue back in May of this year, I went to Fort Madison, Iowa, to attend a sort of solidarity informational rally that was attended by some rail workers, but a lot of retirees. Jeff Kurtz put it together, and you'll meet him here in a moment. Just to kind of draw attention to just how much damage this attendance policy was having on the workforce, right? It was modestly attended. About 40 people showed up. We listened to a lot of really great speeches from workers and union officials across the spectrum in terms of Iowa labor, which was really cool to see. And in the course of those conversations, I started to get a sense of just how unreal just these policies have been on the workforce and ultimately on the supply chain, right? The supply chain is a vast sort of vascular system of trade in both domestically inside the country and outside of the country. And it kind of relies on every piece working exactly as intended, whether that's trucking, whether that's the moving of freight on the rails, whether that's shipping coming in from outside of the country into the country, or just moving items and goods and the various from within our borders in order for us to get our economy moving. When one thing falls off, it causes bottlenecks across the entire system. And so what we were seeing was, this overburdened workforce of rail workers who take their jobs extremely seriously. They understand exactly what part they play in this, larger sort of economic sustainment in this country, right? And they're being driven into the ground, like blood from a stone, right? And, I listened to workers talk about these attendance policies and, just the years of this contract negotiation causing such strife and problems. And what ultimately ended up happening is it's affecting the supply chain all the way across the board. Shipping containers can't come to the ports if there's no space at the ports. They have to be offloaded onto freight, and trucking companies have tried to pick up the slack, but there's only so much you can do, right? So when one thing fails, it causes problems all across the board. And the reality is that the rail carriers are shooting themselves in the foot doing this, right? They are the major cause of quite a bit of this, right? And what it comes down to is that this is what the unions are really pushing to make sure that their workforce is not going to continue to be overburdened by rail carriers who are making billions of dollars in profit every quarter, right? It's just not going to happen. My second piece of reporting was this continued sort of solidarity and informational rallies that have been held by the 13 rail unions as a way to continue to keep this narrative either in the news cycle or to inform the communities that this affects, right? And to give folks a chance to really sit down and understand how massive this issue is, right? And so I went to Galesburg, Illinois, and I got to meet a lot of really amazing workers and see some folks that I had seen from previous reporting that are now, folks that I check in with regularly. And I got the same thing. This entire workforce is not gunning for a strike, right? They want to go back to work. They want to be able to work these jobs that they, and some of these folks are third and fourth generation workers who have been working on the railroads their entire lives, right? All they're looking for is, the respect that they deserve. And the rail carriers continue to refuse to give it to them.
Hell yeah. I think that's beautifully and powerfully put. As always, it's truly an honor to get to work with Mel. Everyone watching should go support Mel's work. And there will be more of it coming here at the Real News Network. And I just wanted to thank her while we're here for doing that great reporting and bringing more eyeballs to this important issue. So, we give you all this kind of introduction because, again, mainstream media has not covered this extensively. It's barely covered it at all. And when it has covered it, it's just been a kind of one-off piece here and there. We've tried to correct that by bringing sustained coverage, but there's a lot here. It's a very complex issue. And we've tried to essentially start this off by putting everyone on an equal footing, refreshing folks' memory about the reporting that we here at the Real News have done on the situation at the railroads, which, the last reporting that we did involved Mel's text reports earlier in the summer, and then my extended interview on my podcast, Working People, with Jay, a longtime train dispatcher, and we actually have a letter that Jay sent in for me to read later on during the Q&A segments. And I just want to encourage folks who are watching the live stream right now to please send in your questions in the live chat, because we will be responding to them in the latter half of this live stream. And lastly, before we get to our amazing guests who are going to essentially fill us in on what's been happening since our last report, right? What happened? What is the Biden's presidential emergency board? They got together. They issued their recommendations. what do they say, right? What have the responses been to those recommendations from the rail carriers and rail workers? How close are we, in fact, to a national rail strike? What would that mean? And of course, as we always ask here at The Real News, what can folks watching and listening out there do to stand in solidarity with their fellow workers? So that's really what we wanted to do to start this live stream. And now we're going to move over to our amazing guests so that they can take the reins from us. But yeah, a couple quick housekeeping things. As people in the live chat have been saying, big shout out to Mel's cat, Peach, who's in the background. I also wanted to give a big shout out to our siblings across the pond, members of the RMT union who have been on a continued work stoppage. They haven't done a continuous strike, but they've been doing targeted strikes. Rail workers in the UK are also going through a whole lot of crap right now. I got to interview a few of those folks for working people as well, but we just wanted to send love and solidarity to everyone in the UK and also the postal workers who are on strike over there. We may have some of them watching the live stream now. And lastly, I just wanted to say, as the editor-in-chief of The Real News, that this Labor Day, we are kicking off a fall fundraiser. We need 100 viewers to pitch in a little each month to make a big difference. If you want us to keep doing coverage like this, we need your help. We're a nonprofit news network. We don't take corporate money. So please help amplify workers on the ground struggles from Baltimore to Bangladesh. You can donate now to keep our work going by heading to therealnews.com/donate. All right. With all that out of the way, let's get to our amazing guests. If you've been watching The Real News, you know them, you love them, you trust them, they know what they're talking about, and I'm honored to have them join us here on the live stream. So let me introduce them really quick. So we've got the great Jeff Kurtz with us. Jeff was a railway engineer and union member for 40 years. He served as a union officer most of his career, including 8 years as president of BLET Local 391 and chairman of the BLET Iowa State Legislative Board, where he oversaw safety and legislative matters for the union in the state for 4 railroads for 10 years. He retired in 2014 and served as state representative for 1 term in the Iowa House after winning the 2018 election in his House district. He now works in a volunteer capacity with Railroad Workers United and the local labor chapter of the Iowa Federation of Labor. Ron Kamenko is currently serving as General Secretary of Railroad Workers United. Prior to hiring out as a brakeman with Conrail in 1996, he served as president of AFSCME Local 634 in Madison, Wisconsin. In 2005, Ron helped to found Railroad Operating Crafts United, an RWU predecessor. A former brakeman, conductor, and engineer for Conrail and later NS in Chicago, he formerly worked for Amtrak in Milwaukee and Chicago, and he currently is working as an Amtrak engineer in Reno, Nevada, where he is the vice president of BLET Local 51. Ron, Jeff, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks for having us, Max.
Well, it's really great to see you guys, and I'm sure that longtime viewers of The Real News who have seen y'all before are excited to see you here again, and they don't want to listen to me talk anymore. They want to hear from you guys about what the hell is going on, and where we are right now. So you heard me me and Mel kind of give the introduction, right? Sort of refreshing people's memories about the reporting that we had done in the first half of this year, right? From BNSF's draconian high-vis attendance policy, driving workers into the ground, to that leading to workers quitting in record numbers, to all of the massive problems with the supply chain that Mel reported on that has been caused by corporate greed, that corporate greed has been going on for years, if not decades, so on and so forth. So where we last left off for folks who watch The Real News, Biden had announced the Presidential Emergency Board to try to offer recommendations that would appease both sides. The board had not yet released its recommendations, but now they have. So I wanted to kind of turn it over to you guys and ask if you could break down for folks what were the recommendations, what's in there, what has the response been from the rail carriers and the folks that you're talking to.
Well, Max, I could go ahead and get us started here. Yeah, so when we last talked, the PEB, I believe, had been appointed. Rail labor had been pushing for a PEB for quite some time. And we got what we wanted. We got a PEB appointed by the president. A lot of us weren't necessarily as optimistic, but the union leadership seemed to be very, very optimistic. It was almost like they had some kind of inside track. I'm not sure why they felt this, but they thought that the PEB was going to really be something that we could all get behind. It turns out that it's something that we can't get behind. And the proof's in the pudding. We just did a survey. 3,200 railroad workers who are party to the agreement did respond. 90 to 95% of them responded unfavorably to the PEB recommendations, stating they would not vote for a tentative agreement that was based upon those PEB recommendations. We also asked another question, would you think that railroad workers should be ready, willing, and able to exercise their right to strike? The percentage responding to that question was even higher, right around 95, 96%. And so there seems to be a consensus. I should just mention that in that survey, we also asked what union you were a member of. There were respondents from every union, roughly proportionate to the numbers who are party to the agreement. We asked people what their seniority bracket was, 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 30 or more, etc. And we also asked what your age group was, because a lot of times demographics and seniority and union and craft will determine whether you might be in favor or opposed to a tentative agreement. The long and the short is you can break down the data in the Excel spreadsheet, and basically any of the seniority groups, the age groups, or union affiliation, and you get 90 to 95% opposed to the recommendations of the PEB, and then once again, a 90 to 97% or so in favor of exercising our right to strike. So this is kind of where we're at now. There's been some interesting developments that we should get into in the course of the program. Some union officials have broken ranks from the United Rail unions and are going to package the PEB as a tentative agreement and put it out in front of their members for a vote. But I don't want to keep going. I'll just say that that's kind of where we're at now. The PEB has issued its recommendations, and it seems like workers across all age groups, seniority, and craft and union are very, very hostile to those recommendations.
Well, and so thank you for that, Ron. And Jeff, before I toss it to you to say a little more about the details of those recommendations, I just wanted to make sure that folks watching and listening to this, kind of understand what you're describing, Ron, because like one of the things that Mel and I learned, the more that we learned about this issue, was like, oh, wow, there are a lot of different unions representing a lot of different folks doing a lot of different things on the railroads. I guess, could you just say a little more for folks so they can kind of keep up with like the sort of makeup of the freight rail system and the different kind of workers who comprise that?
I think you could speak to that better than I could, probably.
I'm sorry. Are you suggesting I do that, Jeff?
Yeah, because you deal with the 13 unions a lot more than I do.
Yeah. So just off the top of my head, so you have the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. They generally represent most engineers in this country. They also represent perhaps 10% of their members are trainmen, otherwise known generally as conductors. You have the SMART, Sheet Metal Rail Air Transportation, the Transportation Division. That union represents most trainmen, most conductors, but some engineers. Then you have the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division. They represent track workers and basic maintainers of the infrastructure along the right of way. Oh, and by the way, the BMWED and the BLET are both affiliates of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. So those are the three biggest unions. And then from there, we have the Transportation Communication Union. They represent clerks and a myriad of other different crafts, including the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen, which is actually independent, quasi-independent of the TCU. Then we have the shop crafts, starting with the Machinist Union, the IAM. Keep in mind that the IAM and the two previous unions I just mentioned, the TCU and the BRC, are all now IAM affiliates. It's a real alphabet soup, a real convoluted quagmire of old, antiquated, out-of-date, ineffectual trade unions that long ago could have merged to form some kind of United Railroad Workers Union. But I'll continue in case you haven't quite had enough. There's also in the shop the IBEW, the Electricians Union. There is the National Conference of Firemen and Oilers, the Laborers and Hostlers. And they're affiliated to the Service Employees International Union, which of course is not part of the AFL-CIO. Then we have the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers and Blacksmiths. Used to have lots and lots of people on the railroad back in the steam engine days. I think we're down to about 300 or 400 of them now, but they get their little piece of the pie. Let's see. Oh, and then we have the Sheet Metal Workers Mechanical Division, or I should say Smart Mechanical Division, which is associated, of course, with Smart Transportation Division. But there's two different divisions inside of the same union. Then we have some other more specialized crafts like the Brotherhood of Signalmen, Railway Signalmen, the BRS. I believe they're independent. And then you have the American Train Dispatchers Association, the ATDA. Probably missing one or two in here. Oh, there's the Transport Workers Union, which is kind of an odd duck, a catch-all, but they have some members too who are party to the national negotiation scene. So you get the idea. This is incredibly complex, incredibly convoluted, incredibly ineffectual. And, you know, our job as rank and file workers and as Railroad Workers United is to attempt to hold these organizations' feet to the fire and hold them together to the extent possible. Because, you know, an injury to one is an injury to all. United we stand, divided we fall. You know, pick your adage, but having 12 different trade unions in the same industry, bargaining with the same set of very, very powerful Fortune 500 Class 1 railroads is just intrinsically a very bad idea, but we play the hand that's dealt to us. And so this is the wall that we are up against. Not only are we going up against some of the most powerful corporations in America, we're doing it with one hand tied behind our back because we are very, very divided by craft, by union, and so forth.
Yeah, definitely was quite surprised to learn more about how these unions work together, and you know, the fact that these negotiations are a coalition of representatives from each of these unions, right? And that they have to work together in order to try and come to some sort of agreement, because they were unable to. You know, I imagine that the rail carriers rarely, if ever, act in good faith. You know, we reached this point with the Railway Labor Act, where a presidential emergency board was appointed. And again, this is sort of a sort of fail-safe in the legislation that clicks into place during these negotiations in order to avert the potential catastrophe of a economic catastrophe of a shutdown, right? As far as the infrastructure is concerned, right? Again, if if the rails shut down, then we see extremely hard bottlenecks in across all industries, right? We're talking about grain rotting in silos because it can't be picked up, this type of thing, right? And that causes ripple effects across the entire country's infrastructure. And to avoid that, the PEB is appointed in order to hear both sides in a sort of mediation type interaction, right? Hear both sides, hear the offer that the rail carriers are at, and hear the offer that the unions would like to get to, right? That normally you would be able to, in good faith negotiations, sit across the table from each other and have that give and take and come to an agreement. The PEB steps in, and so they hear this, they make their consideration, and then they come back with a recommendation that either side can either accept or not accept, right? It's not binding at this point. So Jeff, if you would, you've taken a look at the PEB recommendations. You've read through the report. Could you kind of give us just like a brief kind of rundown of what has been recommended by the PEB, just for folks to get an understanding of what's on the table at this point?
Okay, thank you, Mel. What they did with wages basically was split the baby. The railroads were willing to offer 17%. The unions wanted 27%. They split it right down the middle, 22%. Compounded, it's 24%. So I can go through the whole PEB, and it just doesn't look like they did a lot of work on this. They talked about things like, the carrier says that train and engine employees only spend 33 hours at work a week, which is not anything I've experienced. In fact, people that I talked to around here said that they're actually on an engine at least 50 hours a week, and a lot of times even more. The carriers also said that their profits, and they said this right in the PEB, their profits were due to the fact that they were willing to take risk, and they invested so much capital, and it had nothing to do with labor, which I found curious for the simple fact, if you go up into a yard, a tower, and usually they're somewhere around 30 feet above ground, and you can look at the myriad of tracks and hundreds of switches. You can look off into the distance. You'll see machinists getting engines ready. You'll see maintenance and way, fixing tracks to make sure that trains, that switch engines and trains don't derail, or if they will re-rail trains that are derailed. You see signalmen out there working for signals. You see the engineers and engine foremen moving back and forth. And I'm thinking, this capital doesn't mean anything without these people all doing their work here. And it was just really a curious statement. And as far as risk, one of the things that I did when I was the Iowa State Legislative Board chairman was I handled some pretty horrific accidents. We had amputations and death. And I would like to know the last time that a railroad CEO or any corporate officer was dismembered or killed in the line of duty. There's no risk. This was just some amazing statements, and the PEB never pushed back. I just wondered how ridiculous a statement would have to be before they would push back and say, that doesn't sound right, or at least go out and do a little research and find out if this is correct or not. And so you go through the PEB and you find this stuff that it just doesn't make any sense. But it seems like from what happened, the recommendations of the PEB, that they took the carrier's word on everything, and which I think is really curious for the simple fact that in April, I think it was the 26th and 27th, the carriers were in front of the Surface Transportation Board, and the Surface Transportation Board pretty well took them apart because of, quite frankly, the lies and mischaracterizations that they made in front of them. And they kept saying things are getting better and things will get better. Well, what are we, 4 months past the time? Things are not getting better. And so it would seem like a PEB would take a look at some of the history that as far as what the railroads say and what's actually going on. They would look at some of the history, like they made a statement about their attendance and availability policies, that it's established procedure that the railroads will set attendance and availability, which is just flat out wrong. They lost that privilege in 2008. I think I've sent to you and your producers cutout. I copy and pasted the part of the Rail Safety Improvement Act that shows that, because the railroads screwed this up so badly that actually the Secretary of Transportation is supposed to review anything that they do as far as scheduling. And it just goes on and on and on. But there was only one instance where one of the crafts actually their recommendations were accepted. That was with BMW ED, and that was something that was a long time coming. I mean, they should have had reimbursements on their travel a long time ago. But the local people are not happy. I've talked to these guys, and quite frankly, a few of them said, remind us of why we voted for a pro-labor president again, because this doesn't look very pro-labor to us. This is, you've disappointed every rail worker around here that I've talked to. I haven't talked to anybody that thinks that this is even a passable deal. So, and another thing that the railroads have done, now that people can't take off, they say with the new high vis policy that rail workers are only allowed 1 day off a month. That's not accurate. You're allowed 1 day off a month if the carrier lets you. So a lot of these guys had to go out and get FMLA because of their own health issues or their own family's health issues. Well, what the carrier has done is, for one thing, they don't talk to a human being anymore. The BNSF, they I think they talk to a recording, and then they communicate by email, which really slows the process up. But if they do have FMLA and they exercise FMLA, what the carriers are doing, say that I stand to go to work, say it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I have a doctor's appointment at 4 o'clock, and I don't think that I'm going to be able to make it if I go to work. So I take off. Say I mark off 2 hours before I go to work. Well, the guy behind me, he'll go to work in my place. Now, when I'm done with my appointment, I'll mark back up, get ready to go to work. What the BNSF is doing is charging the employee that took FMLA. They're charging him the entire time that the guy that worked his turn is gone. So he might be gone 40 hours. You might have been off 3 or 4 hours. He's gone 40 hours. They're charging 40 hours against your FMLA, which the federal government is is saying is illegal, but nobody's being penalized for it. But that's just some of the stuff that's going on. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot, right? I mean, and we're not going to be able to rehash all of that. I mean, just speaking for myself, right? So I've done a real news recording with Jeff, one with Jeff and Ron, one with Jay, the train dispatcher. Collectively about over 5 hours worth of conversation about this, and we still haven't covered a lot of it. But I just want to make sure for folks who are watching, you should go check out those reports if you want a deeper kind of understanding of what this looks like on a day-to-day basis for folks working on the railroads, right? But just to kind of like synthesize what Jeff was talking about, then we're going to go to Ron to talk to us about in finer detail the results of the Railroad Workers United survey, asking members about their response to the PEB, and then we're going to lead into Q&A. So if y'all haven't already, please do send in the questions that you want us to talk about in the live chat on YouTube right now. But again, like we were saying in the beginning, right, this is a long brewing crisis. That was the first thing that both Ron and Jeff told me the first time I ever talked on the phone with them, was you need to understand how far back this goes, right? If you live near a rail line and you feel like the trains have been getting longer and heavier, that's not your imagination. They have. And not only that, but at that same time, the rail carriers have been, like those trains used to have like 5 people running them. The rail carriers have been slashing those crews down to the point that they're now 2-man crews on those trains. And the rail carriers during these negotiations have been trying to get it down to 1, right? And Jay, the dispatcher that I spoke to on Working People, describes in horrifying detail how bad of a situation that can be if you have a derailment with a freight train that is carrying hazardous materials and you only have 1 person in the cab. You don't have another person to go check on that. There's so much that goes into that it could lead to really catastrophic consequences. And also it's just doing what workers are experiencing in so many different industries. They're having more work piled on fewer workers. This is what healthcare workers have been telling us. This is what educators have been telling us. I just interviewed a Dollar General worker in Louisiana who told us that there are often 1 or 2 people running an entire store, right? So this is something that is very much a plague that working people are dealing with in so many different industries. But when you add all of this together on the railroads, you end up with workers who are being run ragged because by definition, a lot of railroaders have no set schedule. You got to go to your terminal when you get that call in the middle of the night. Sometimes there are delays. You're sitting rotting on the track for hours. Sometimes your time off means like just sitting in a motel in a strip mall somewhere far away from home until you can hitch a ride back to your home terminal. And then you add on top of that these draconian attendance policies that make it impossible for workers to really call out sick, to go to the hospital if a loved one is sick, let alone to go to a t-ball game or anything like that. It really is just treating workers with so much disregard to the point that they are being run ragged. They are quitting in record numbers, or as Ron can tell you, a lot of them have been fleeing the freight service and becoming refugees in the passenger service, foregoing years of accrued seniority and benefits and so on and so forth. It's that bad. And like I said at the beginning, we have to acknowledge the fact that the rail carriers right now are complaining about a labor shortage. They can't hire enough people to fill their needs. Well, as we've talked a lot about here at the Real News, first off, you collectively, rail carriers, laid off 30% of your workforce over the past 5 years. So that's kind of on you. And then secondly, these draconian attendance policies are making it so that new workers don't want to hire out on the railroads, because why would they if they're seeing the ways that, people who are on the railroads now are being treated. So I just wanted to sort of synthesize that for folks to say this is a long brewing crisis, and the PEB, the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations that we've been talking about, as Ron and Jeff have said, as so many others have said, really doesn't address those underlying safety issues that are leading workers to get burnt out and quit, and for, like dangerous situations to crop up on the railroads. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone kind of was on the same footing there. Now, before we get to Q&A, Ron, I wanted to sort of toss it back to you and ask if you could say a bit more about this massive survey that y'all conducted at Railroad Workers United, and I guess what viewers should really understand about the results.
For sure, Max. So it's complicated, like everything is. I'm sure there are viewers right now who are saying, wow, what's wrong with those guys? I mean, I'm lucky to get a 2% increase. Well, first of all, let's break it down. It's 22%. It's over 5 years. And while it is championed by the industry as the biggest wage increase we've gotten in 40 years, I think that says more about the lack of wage increases over those last 40 years than it says about this wage increase. Coincidentally, but not, 40 years ago is when we had the largest or the highest rate of inflation. And so a lot of this wage increase over those 5 years is going to be eaten up by rises in the consumer price index. And who knows what next year and the year after holds. If we continue, obviously, at even 5% inflation rate, that pretty much eats up the entire wage increase. But the thing that people have to understand is this round of bargaining, it wasn't really about money. People aren't leaving the industry just because they're feeling underpaid. Railroad jobs are generally some of the best blue-collar jobs you can still get without a college education and so forth. And the work is actually quite enjoyable still for many people, except there's this thing called management and the oppression that we face. And so this round of bargaining, we felt, given the objective conditions, supply chain crisis, labor shortage, quote unquote, friends of labor in government, a united bargaining coalition, I could go on and on. We felt we were actually going to win something. So I need to set the background a little bit deeper before people can really get their heads around why the overwhelming number of railroaders from all crafts, age groups, and seniority are so hostile to this thing. So the PEB punted on just about every damn issue. And I just want to quickly summarize. So looking down the issues, and I'll just read a few of them here from the PEB. The unions asked that we get 3 federal holidays off. Veterans Day, we don't have that. And then Martin Luther King and Juneteenth. They denied, the PEB said, no, we don't recommend any new holidays. We asked for multiple personal leave days to compensate for the fact that we hardly have any scheduled time off. The PEB actually came through for us. One additional personal holiday recommended. Most railroad workers don't have sick leave, despite the fact that we have these draconian attendance policies, are expected to show up for work all the time, that we're essential workers, that we work in close quarters with one another, that we're always fatigued, we're prone, given our work schedules and stuff, to illness and so forth. We don't have sick time. Here's what the PEB said, that the organization withdraw the proposal. Schedules and off days. Once again, quality of work-life issues. The PEB says we remand the parties back to negotiations. Well, that's what we just did for 2.5 years that proved fruitless. So why is the PEB telling us to go back to the table, which didn't bear any fruit? Attendance policies, as Jeff and Max have referenced. We believe they should be negotiated. It's a change in the conditions of employment, number one, which is a mandatory subject of bargaining under any labor law. And 2, as Jeff pointed out, the RSIA of 2008 mandated that anything that could be fatigue-inducing needs to be brought public. No, they just unilaterally rammed through these policies. So what did the PEB say on this one? That the organization withdraw the proposal to negotiate attendance policies. BLET and SMART, the operating crafts, meal allowance. It's 50 years out of date. It's actually meaningless, the amount of money we get from meal allowances away from home. We're away from home 150 days a year, maybe more than that. Once again, PEB, remand the parties back to negotiations. And then it goes from there, the different crafts, the signal maintainers, yard masters, shop crafts, TCU, clerical, and the dispatchers. Every single specific craft request for changes in conditions of employment, work rules, etc. PEB says that the organization withdraw the proposal. And it's almost it's a slap in the face to just be told for almost every single question that you want to bargain over, to have this authority simply say, withdraw the proposal, carte blanche. Or, in even more of a slap in the face, go back and negotiate with the carrier who basically has just told you to shove it. Go back to the table and talk to them some more. So it's insulting. And then this is the context within which we float this survey, basically through Twitter, through Facebook, just online. We had very quickly 2,000 responses the very first day. Then it quickly tapered off. We ended up with just over 3,100 responses. And it's very, very telling. And like I said earlier, every union, every craft, every age group, and every seniority, it's 90 to 95%. And so specifically, I'll read the questions. Let's see here. So the two big questions that we asked, well, three. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best, did the PEB meet your hopes and expectations for a good contract? The worst is 1. We had 923 people say 1, which was the worst they could rate it, which is almost a third of the people responding. And then it goes up from there, 2, 735, 3, 592, 4, 353, and so forth. But literally 90% of the people responding said that the PEB was a 4, 3, 2, or 1 in terms of meeting their expectation. So that brings to the next question. If the PEB recommendations were offered to you by your union as is in the form of a tentative agreement, would you vote yes or no? 2,917 people say no. Only 218 say that they would vote for this. And then the next question, do you think railroad workers should exercise their right to strike on or after September 16th as allowed under the Railway Labor Act? 3,001 said yes, 132 said no. That's a little bit curious because you have more people actually saying that we should strike than those who said we should vote the thing down. And I can speculate the reason for that is the cynicism of some railroad workers that there's no way we can win. There's no way the U.S. government won't break our strike. And so therefore, I'm going to vote yes. I'm going to hold my nose and do it, but I have to because we have no alternative. And so if those people believed that strike action could actually win a better contract, looking at the numbers, you would have probably almost another 100 people saying that the PEB sucks. So it's absolutely overwhelming. There's a consensus in rail labor like I personally have never seen in 25 years of railroading.
I think that's a great kind of segue here into what I think is a very, very important question that is on everyone's minds. And that is, how close are we to a strike? And if we do strike, what do we, if railroad workers do strike, what is that going to look like? Because I'm young enough to not know what a rail strike looks like in my lifetime, right? And I would have no idea what that looks like now. You can look at RMT rail strikes in the UK and get a sort of example of what that might look like. But I have no conception of what a work stoppage looks like in the United States. Either of you, if you could, just kind of give us a sort of, what does that picture look like if we do reach the point where workers are walking off the job?
Well, as far as when, if nothing's done right now, tentatively, it looks like 12:01 a.m. Eastern time, September the 16th. Is when they would walk, which would be where I am in Iowa. It'd be 11:01 p.m. on the 15th. And if there is a strike, I would be surprised if it goes more than 24 hours. if it's up to the membership, they'll strike. I think that's a given, especially with the carriers saying that it's because of them. It's because of no contributions from labor. It's all them, their risk taking and their capital investment. That just really pissed a lot of people off. In fact, they're having T-shirts made with that quote across the front. But if it went on a week, you would see probably empty grocery shelves. You would see grain rotting in silos. In fact, I think some agricultural organization has gone to the president asking him to stop this before it even starts. You would see like building materials. If you go to a hardware store or something, those shelves would be empty. It would be a real, if it went on too long, it'd be a real disaster. But like I said, apparently the carriers think that they can do this themselves. I'd love to see what they do.
Yeah, you guys, I would add to that. Last time we had a rail strike was 31 years ago. I think it lasted 8 or 9 hours. And generally, the way it works under the Railway Labor Act, and this is different from a lot of countries, including the UK, we would be faced with a back to work order by Congress. And so the Senate and the House would have to meet, and they have done this in the past, lickety split. I believe the last vote was 450 to 3 to order us back to work. And I think most railroad workers, our unions and the carriers, have no illusion that Congress wouldn't vote us back to work. There's always the potential for political infighting and posturing, so that perhaps Republicans or maybe Democrats would have this idea that, hey, if we blame the shutdown and the economic mess that's created on the other party, if we could drag this out a little bit, there could be that potential to delay a vote. But more than likely, by early morning on Saturday, the 16th, House and Senate would easily pass back to work legislation, and it would be signed by the president. And I'm talking literally within hours here, and we would be ordered back to work. So the Congress has a bunch of options. They can order us back to work under the terms of the PEB. They can order us back to work under different terms, but that would probably take a lot of effort. And most representatives have no idea of what would even be going on, because this will be the first time in 31 years we've had a national rail strike. And so probably most representatives would be very unfamiliar with the process, and they would not have the time to look into what a different contract could look like other than the PEB. So those are two options. They could also mandate us back to work and then mandatory binding arbitration, or they could just simply do nothing and let the strike roll. And so this is something that railroad workers, lament. And for 25 years, I've heard this on the railroad, how tragic it is that, in effect, we do not have the right to strike. And I always correct people, and I say, no, we do have the right to strike. And of course, if you don't use a right, then you don't have that right. And so this is an opportunity where we could actually exercise that right for the first time in many, many years. But if railroad workers were to strike, and if Congress did not impede our strike, I, for one, and I believe probably upwards of 90% of my colleagues in the industry would agree, we would win, hands down, because we would create such havoc. The rail industry would lose so much money that the stockholders would rebel and say, we need to settle, and we would settle on much better terms. It's only because our right to strike is so restricted that our hands are tied. And it has caused the crisis at hand. Because if we had been free to strike for the last 100 years under the Railway Labor Act, freely, or at least more freely than what we are, we could have corrected some of this power imbalance historically, and we would have not had such draconian attendance policies. We would have not had the lack of time off. We would have not had the Nazification of the industry, because we would have been able to exercise some degree of power, and we would have been able to set the industry straight and make them bow to our wishes. But because it's so difficult for railroad workers to actually carry forth a protracted strike that can be effective, the rail industry knows, for the most part, that they can get away with screwing us. And so the question of striking, and it's all maybe glorious and romantic, and as much as railroad workers may want that, we also are tempered by the fact that we have to face the reality of the harsh conditions that we are dealt with. So the coming days and weeks will definitely tell the story. I'll leave it at that, but we do need to talk about the fact that these three unions have reached a tentative agreement, and kind of walk through that whole question.
We have a question from one of the folks in chat that covers that, so I think we'll definitely be able to have a conversation about that. You actually answered the follow-up question I was going to have, which was, currently we're dealing with a Congress that it loves to engage in shenanigans that lead to nothing getting done. And my question was, would that happen? Should they need to pass emergency legislation? Would we see the same type of shenanigans that have plagued us for the last 10 years longer, right? But you kind of answered that question. I think the thing that I would like to sort of say, and then we're going to get into the final segment of the night, which is audience, Q&A, folks who are in the chat in the live stream on YouTube. If you would like to ask a question, please put a question in the chat, and we'll bring it up and hopefully have the chance to answer it. But my final question before we start is should this happen even now, what can people who don't work on the railroads do to help or to show solidarity with the folks who are currently going through this particularly stressful time as we're moving closer and closer to a shutdown? Either of you.
Oh, okay. I think they could picket with us. They could rally with us. They could write their congressmen and their senators saying, if you're not going to allow these people to strike, if they're that valuable, treat them better. Back 50 years ago, I hired out in 1974. We had nothing that resembled these attendance and availability policies. You took off when you thought you needed to take off. And we never had problems getting crews. I mean, there were crews for every train. Now, the industry has gotten everything they've wanted, everything that they've wanted, and they've got trains sitting all over. There's an article in Trains Magazine about the BNSF, how proud they are of themselves. They set up an embargo. They weren't running, I think it was some of their manifest trains into Los Angeles, and they're going to actually release that embargo only a month late. It's like, this is, if you ever read Superman comics like I did when I was younger, he would go to Bizarro World, and right was left, up was down. That's what it seems like to me. We're in Railroad Bizarro World.
Thoughts on picketing and attending rallies? Obviously, most of you in the viewing audience live in a city or town where there's probably a railhead, and so there's a terminal. And so if it's a national strike, we're talking about pretty much BNSF, Union Pacific, NS, CSX. So you name it: Atlanta, Memphis, Nashville, New York City, Oakland, California, Denver, Colorado, you name it. There is a railhead, there is a yard, there will be a picket line. So people are encouraged to find out where the local terminal is and be ready to head on down there. Like I say, if it happens, it might be quick and it might be over before you even know it. But it does offer a great opportunity for community activists members of other unions from other industries to interface with railroad workers. So we'd love to have you down on the picket line. That's the first thing, and Jeff talked about that. You can subscribe to the Railroad Workers United news service and get all the news and how things are developing, because believe me, our ear is to the rail. We don't miss a lick out there. And we do issue a weekly bulletin every Tuesday, and the special bulletins as needed throughout the week. And you can do that by going to our website, which is also a wealth of information, and that's railroadworkersunited.org. And a pop-up block will come up if you want to subscribe, so you can do it quick and easy that way. If you are a member of a community organization, environmental group, or a union and would like to issue a statement of solidarity, however you want to word it, that's your business. Please do so, and you can email it to us. You'll find our address to email that on our website that I just mentioned. And then last but not least, Max talked about the two-person crew issue, which is auxiliary to this whole struggle, but is coinciding in an interesting coincidental fashion. Well, not really coincidental. It's the issue of crew staffing minimums. The rail industry for 18 years now has been pushing for single employee operations of trains, and we have fought them tooth and nail. And so far we are victorious, but they continue to push and push and push, and they've come very, very close. And so at this point in history, the Federal Railroad Administration, the federal administration that governs things like railroad safety and lots of other rail issues, is accepting public comment on a proposed rulemaking for train crew minimum staffing. Now, as worded, this rule has a huge loophole big enough to run a 10,000 foot freight train right through. So that loophole needs to be closed. But I won't, without elaborating on that, I would just say it would be great if anybody wants to go and submit, and I'm not sure how I can get that link out to people, but through this format, but we would love to have everybody in the community submit comments in opposition, in opposition to single person train crew operation and in support of a very, very strong, ironclad, bulletproof two-person minimum train crew law. So these are a few things that people can do right off the bat to assist us.
So what we can do is from the Real News Network account, we can drop that link in the comments to this video after the live stream is over, because this video will live on our YouTube channel. The live chat will move over to the comments, so we can drop that in there so that folks who are watching this can have it ready at hand. I wanted to kind of pick up on the question that you mentioned before, Ron, because it's something folks in the live chat have been asking about, right? You did a beautiful job sort of like breaking down the kind of rat's nest of different, unions, carriers, rail lines, portions of the country covered by this or that company, so on and so forth, right? It's a tangled mess. But right now, it's really important for folks to understand, right, how the actions of one side affect the rest. And so someone brought up what you brought up, which was, I think they referenced the IBEW potentially taking the framework of the PEB, the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations, for those who missed the first half of the live stream. There are a number of unions that have, as y'all said, taken these recommendations, turned them into the template for a tentative agreement that they are going to put up for a vote with their membership. So I guess, folks, could you talk a little more, Jeff and Ron, about what that means for the larger struggle here?
It's really unfortunate. These 12 unions, 13 or 14, depending on how you slice them, is an incredible impediment to our solidarity and our unity, and has been for the last century. Well, more for 150 years. Let's face it. There's been efforts to unite these unions over the last 150 years. Railroad Workers United is just simply the latest manifestation of that sentiment, of that effort for unity and solidarity. So here we are, finally, for the first time in history, we have this thing called the United Rail Unions, who all basically have come together in solidarity around winning a good contract. The problem is there was nothing legal and binding. There was no pledge of solidarity. There was no agreement that no one settles till every union is ready to settle. And so sure enough, the PEB is issued without polling the membership, without a whole lot of internal discussion that we can see. And of course, we're not party to everything that the union officials decide and discuss. 3 unions, although they're actually all associated with the machinists. There's the IAM, who are the mechanics in the diesel shop. There's the TCU, who are clerks and other associated myriad of different crafts. And then there's the Brotherhood of Railroad Carmen, the car inspectors. Those 3 unions are all, through one form or another, affiliated to the machinist union. And those 3 unions will be presenting a tentative agreement to their members in the coming days and weeks. There was no whimper, there was no outcry. Apparently, this was just all accepted by the craft union structure, that this is somehow legitimate. It would be like the United Auto Workers going into contract talks with General Motors, and then let's say the workers on the such and such line, and I know nothing about auto plants, but those workers that represent just 15% of the UAW said, we're going to settle, and we don't really care about the other 85% of the union. It's really no difference in a sense. But, you know, this is 150 years of backward craft unionism at play here. And so this tentative agreement is going to be mailed out in the form of, you know, a proposed contract to 15,000 railroad workers who make up the membership of those 3 unions. If it is approved, it would set a pattern under the Railway Labor Act. They like to look at things like, well, who settled for what? And so arbitrators and boards and Congress and the Senate and other officials who don't really know too much about the specifics and the ins and outs, they want to look at a precedent-setting agreement. So, oh, well, IAM, TCU, and BRC all settled for the terms and conditions recommended by the Presidential Emergency Board. So therefore, you other 9 unions that aren't settling, there's huge pressure on them now to settle under the existing terms. So therefore, Railroad Workers United, as of today, is launching a Vote No campaign, and we urge rank and file workers of the TCU, of the BRC, of the IAM, to vote this thing down. It's not in your interest. It's certainly not in the interest of the other 85% of rail labor to have this contract adopted. And as we talked about earlier in the segment about the survey, it's not like the membership of those 3 unions disagreed with the rest of rail labor, at least from what our survey showed. They were mostly, for the most part, in lockstep, 90 to 95%, voting that they disapprove of the PEB and would not vote for a tentative agreement based upon those recommendations. So this is kind of where we're at in the craft war, I call it, not the class war. It's the craft war between the different craft unions, because often negotiations with the rail carriers has more to do with negotiations between the disparate unions and crafts, where we have to get our act together, we have to stand in solidarity, and we have to negotiate between us what is acceptable and what isn't. So, you know, our goal right now, vote this down. That will send a message to the carriers. It'll send a message to Congress and the president, the American people, and the rail union leadership that please don't try to repackage the PEB once again in the form of a tentative agreement to the other 9 unions, because they're going to vote it down too. So let's vote this thing down, and then we can start moving forward, possibly with some serious negotiations with the carriers where we actually can win a few things. Because as I pointed out, all of those work rule suggestions, demands from the unions were out of hand dismissed by the PEB. So with a little hope, we'll vote this TA down and move forward with something better for all of us.
Great. I got a couple of questions here. I'm going to try and ask them sort of together because I think they kind of are pretty related here. Ethan Mackey sent in a question to the RWU Facebook page, which reads in part, why do we not get the same national mainstream media and news outlets that UPS does? Why is the media attention so different? Are we not Teamsters as well? He says. As a BMW ED member, it's interpreted that our branch isn't as important to the health, development, and growth of our nation, brotherhood, and all unions, both affiliated and not. Why are we not getting the same media coverage? And, Tony Smith in the chat here has also asked a very interesting question that I think kind of can tie it pretty well into this as well, which is, which political party do you think is most likely to try and support this for political gain, whether it's a strike or a continued sort of move in a direction? The Biden administration sure likes to attempt to position itself as a pro-labor administration, but it continues to sort of fall a little short, I would say. But we'll let this kind of come into the group here. The media question, I think me and Max have had many a conversation about. But we'd like to get everyone's thoughts about these two questions because they are important questions.
Well, as far as why the rest of the media isn't covering this, I think that there's powerful forces involved in this. You've got Warren Buffett, that ultimately he owns the BNSF. There's a lot of powerful people. There's a lot of hedge funds, and a lot of people that own these railroads that are making a ton of money. And they pretty well control the mainstream media. They don't want this out, and I think this is a lesson for the unions. I think we need to do a better job educating people when we're not in the middle of a crisis like this. We need to educate people better on what these crafts do and the importance to our country. As far as what political party is liable to support this, it's their donors. And so I look for, if it comes down to a vote about putting these people back to work, it's going to be it's going to be bipartisan. So, I mean, I don't think that you're going to be able to look to any one party. And it's really too bad. My mother and father were born in 1929 and 1930. They were Roosevelt Democrats. And, we heard this as we grew up, that, these are the people that'll protect you. And over the last 40 years, it just hasn't happened. And I'm saying this as a former Democratic politician, but you can't depend on either political party to help you out in this. And I think, quite frankly, we'd be better off. The railroad industry and the country would be better off if they would do something about this agreement, because I see bad things happening if this thing goes through. I think, for one thing, that's going to happen as soon as the back pay drops, because I think something that looks like this PEB is going to be implemented. As soon as that back pay drops, you're going to see a mass exodus from the rail industry, and that's going to start causing a lot of other problems.
Question. Yeah, we don't really have any support. As I mentioned earlier, the vote 450 to 3 speaks for itself. It was bipartisan. Send them back to work. That will happen most likely again in a very lopsided fashion with very, very few Democrats or Republicans breaking ranks. We don't have a political party in this country as working people. I've often heard it said the Republicans are the party of the big, super rich, and the Democrats are simply the party of the rich. You can look at it how you want, but I don't think for railroad workers that we need to waste too much time hair splitting about Tweedledee, Tweedledum, which one is less anti-labor than the other. What we need to do is organize, get our act together, and fight to defend ourselves and the rest of the working class, rather than be wasting a whole hell of a lot of time with elections and philandering around with worthless politicians of both parties. That's just my personal opinion. On the question of media, it is interesting that a national strike is looming in rail that could be devastating in so many ways, but there's so little that's out there in the mainstream media. I mean, I'm not a watcher of Democracy Now!, but somebody just told me who is an avid watcher, that there's nothing even on that left of center media outlet. So it makes you wonder, is it not news until it actually happens? Well, the thing that I know the best is rail unions. And I do know that the rail unions are incredibly gun shy. They're very cautious, very conservative, and with good reason that they are, hostile to the media. They don't want to be misquoted, taken out of context. As I just told a reporter earlier today, I said, well, I've been misquoted and taken out of context for 40 years. But if we don't make our case and if we don't state our position, no one's going to. And so the job of the trade unions, and it's difficult because there's 12 of them, and they're not necessarily all in cahoots or in lockstep. They can't speak generally with a single voice, but the trade unions simply have to get the word out there and issue press releases, ask to be interviewed, return phone calls from the media, and otherwise state our case. Because if we don't state our case, as railroad workers who have a legitimate position, a legitimate gripe, a set of grievances, and a set of ideas, no one's going to do it for us. And so the unions simply got to get off the couch and start to promote rail labor the way it needs to be promoted.
It's well said, man. And like Mel said, we could go off about this for days. As people in the media who have been trying to cover this and trying to get other outlets to cover it. But this isn't about us, right? I mean, so we'll save that for another time. I guess we'll have to bring you guys back on for a working people episode or something like that. I would just say, as the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network, we do what we can with a small crew. It's amazing that we get to put on conversations like this to try to educate people. And I would just say to folks watching and listening, if you can, please support us. Please support any other media outlet that you see doing this work. Support Labor Notes. Support In These Times. Support anyone who's lifting up the voices and struggles of working people, honestly and with principle. People who aren't misrepresenting what workers are saying. People who aren't just trying to kind of make a name for themselves by ventriloquizing the working class and positioning themselves as some working class whisperer pundit when they live in a mansion in DC, yada, yada, yada. You guys get the point. So if you can, there's a QR code there. We're doing our big Labor Day fundraising push. We would appreciate the help so we can keep doing more like this. But what I would say on top of that is you all have a role to play here, right? You all can help us do what Ron and Jeff are describing. Share this conversation with folks around you. Share them on your social media networks. If corporate media is not going to do it, we have to do it. So however you do it, I don't care. And like I said, it doesn't have to be just us. There are a lot of great outlets doing this work that don't get enough support. Make sure people are seeing that. Make sure that people understand, the details that they need to understand to know how we got here, what we can do to show solidarity with our fellow workers and hold these corporate profiteers to account, along with the politicians who are letting them run our country and our economy and our people and our world into the ground. enough soapboxing from me, but just wanted to really emphasize that we all can do something to counteract that corporate media silence. You don't have to have a podcast or be an editor at a news network to help get the word out. And I wanted to just again really thank everyone for watching. We're gonna close out here in a second. I wanted to really thank Ron and Jeff for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. I cannot thank Mel enough for all the incredible work that she does for the Real News and elsewhere. Also, you don't see him behind the scenes, but the amazing Dwayne Gladden has been running this whole recording. So I wanted to shout Dwayne out and thank him for running this live stream for us. I wanted to close things out by reading another, viewer / listener submitted question, this time from a familiar voice. You guys may have heard at the beginning that I mentioned that I recently interviewed Jay, a longtime train dispatcher on my podcast, Working People. And I also, I've seen a lot of folks shouting out the RMT union in the live chat. Again, nothing but solidarity with our siblings across the pond, our siblings north in Canada who have also been experiencing labor struggles on the rails and beyond. Please build that international solidarity however you can. And if you want to listen to some RMT rail workers yourselves, go on to the Real News or Working People and listen to the panel conversation that I got to have with 4 RMT members last month. So with all that in mind, I wanted to close us out by letting Jay, our boy Jay, kind of give us the final word here, because I thought in typical fashion, if you listen to the episode, you'll see how eloquent and passionate Jay is. He's a qualified conductor who was licensed to operate locomotives at 19 years old and became a qualified train dispatcher before he was 23. And I had the honor of interviewing Jay on Working People. So he couldn't make it to the live stream today. And there were a number of other rank and file workers that we wanted to get on, but because schedules are so nuts on the railroads, we weren't able to. So again, I'm grateful to Ron and Jeff for really helping carrying the load for us. But Jay sent this in for me to read. So I'll close out with this. Quote, "Many of us across the nation and indeed within the rail industry are feeling the pressure being placed upon the backs of middle-class America at the hands of our corporate officials. In the official statement by the Railroad Workers United, words like unappreciated, vacant, betrayal, discontentment, and bitter highlight the frustration and defeat we are all feeling. Corporations have become emboldened by years of disorganization among our unions, countless givebacks at the bargaining table, and scores of job cuts. Across this great nation, people are suffering, trying to determine how they will pay their bills or what they will buy to eat this week. The things that shouldn't matter as much as they do today are robbing us of the time we should be spending focusing on our loved ones and our time together. Once upon a time, I took pride in my work, enjoyed what I did, and felt like part of something greater. Unfortunately, the railroads said in a recent statement that labor plays no role in their profits or success. They claim the average railroad employee works 33 hours per week and that we make over $110,000 per year, supposedly making us among the most well-compensated workers in America. I can assure you that I have never worked a 33-hour week on the railroads, and I've not earned anywhere near the $110,000 the company claims we do. I suppose they are talking about their managers when they fluff the statistics in their favor. As we move closer and closer to a national rail shutdown, it has become clear that the railroads and corporations at large are testing our resolve. They are playing the long game with their union-busting tactics and emotional abuse in the hopes of breaking the spirit and backs of their workers. They've already broken the backs of so many families in the railroad towns that they've decimated in the name of Wall Street, desecrating the legacies and histories written generations ago by men and women who built our nation. It is with this in mind that I implore my fellow Americans who are suffering to unite behind this movement. Never in my adult life have I felt a sense of urgency or importance surrounding our future more than I do now. We are seeing malfeasance the likes of which is nearly incomprehensible across our leaders from local to national levels. The very fabric of our great country is being unwoven before our eyes, while the top 1% hoards 99% of the wealth. In the RWU statement, President Biden is quoted as having said he will be the most pro-labor president you ever had. Well, in a few short weeks, we will get to see how pro-labor our government officials really are. Everything we use every day at some point in its life cycle touches a train somewhere. To say America will be crippled by a short railroad shutdown would fall woefully short of properly describing the devastation that would be brought on by this. Grain would rot inside rail cars. Refrigerated foods would spoil as chilled cars run out of fuel. Gasoline and other fuels normally delivered to market would become scarce because refineries must close due to lack of raw materials. Chickens and other livestock would starve to death or be euthanized, and countless other atrocities would take place at the hands of these corporate elitists. All the while, nothing will happen to them for what they've done. At this point, I believe a strike is nearly impossible to avoid. I believe the railroads think we won't do it or the government won't permit it. They're playing a game of Russian roulette as a calculated risk that their smug attitudes and arrogant behavior won't come back to bite them in the ass. Meanwhile, deep inside the hollers of America, across the cornfields of the Midwest, the valleys of the Northeast, and the mountains dividing sea from shining sea, a growing movement is forming. A rumbling of activity one could liken to distant thunder, or the imminent eruption of a volcano, is signaling the storm that is about to be unleashed upon those who have awoken a sleeping giant. No more shall the underrepresented be oppressed, the underpaid be spat upon, the overworked forgotten, or the working American be thrown to the wayside. We are America, and we will win this war. End quote. I figure that's as good a spot as any for us to end on. What do you guys think?
Perfect.
Very good. Very good.
Real good. And thank you, Mel. Thank you, Max. Hope to see you guys soon. And I'll be talking to you soon, Ron.
Sounds good, Jeff. Thanks, you guys. We'll see
Thank
you
you.
soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Trust and believe we will continue bringing y'all coverage on this. So please subscribe to the Real News Network, subscribe to our newsletter, our YouTube channel, podcast feeds. We're going to keep bringing you as much coverage as we can. Thank you so much for watching this live stream and giving us an hour and a half of your time. Thank you for caring about this issue. And for all of us here at the Real News Network, this is Maximillian Alvarez signing off. Before you go, please head on over to therealnews.com/donate. Become a monthly sustainer of our work so we can keep bringing you important coverage and conversations just like this. And please, please stand in solidarity with our fellow workers on the railroads. Show support however you can. Do not forget about them. Spread the word. Solidarity forever.